The Russian major opened the torpedo tube and suddenly realized to his horror that the temperature of the nuclear warhead was 135 degrees. He quickly ordered to open the torpedo tube and prepare to launch, but the temperature suddenly rose to 148 degrees over 160 degrees. It could explode. The major rushed to his superiors to request a launch, but the reply was to wait 4 minutes. The major grabbed the lieutenant's hand and saw the time had just passed 2.5 minutes. By now the temperature of the nuclear warhead had reached 168 degrees. The major immediately ordered the torpedo to be fired, but it was too late. The torpedo warhead exploded in an instant. The explosion immediately blew the Russians in both compartments off the ship. The explosion threw the submarine off balance and it crashed into the seabed. But the sand absorbed the inertial force and the submarine didn't disintegrate. But the Russians had just begun to suffer. The surviving Russians closed the hatches and asked the commanding officer to surface. But the commanding officer was already in flames from the explosion, and the Russians were trapped and blown to death. The flames of the explosion are scorching the other fish and another deadly explosion is imminent. The Russians were staring at the temperature sensors anxiously looking for a solution, but the Russians suddenly realized in despair that all the temperature sensors had gone out, proving that the temperature had exceeded the limit. Torpedo after torpedo exploded in a chain equivalent to 20,000 kilograms of TNT detonated together. Russian troops were instantly engulfed in flames and the nuclear submarine was also blown up with holes. The 18-meter-high mushroom cloud rose from the sea like the end of the world and the Grim Reaper. Desperate explosion has just stopped. Tons of seawater immediately poured into the nuclear submarine. Russians cannot be lucky to survive the explosion. Quickly run to the submarine's aft cabin No. 9 to take refuge. The lieutenant immediately called the Russians in compartment 5 and ordered all survivors to evacuate to compartment 9. But to his surprise, the Russians in compartment 5 refused, saying that the submarine's nuclear reactor cooling system had been blown up and that failure to activate the backup system would result in a worldwide disaster, and that we couldn't leave without turning the place into a second Chernobyl. The lieutenant had to hang up the radio and lead the surviving Russians to compartment 9. The lieutenant quickly began to count the number of survivors, 23 Russians still alive. Immediately, the lieutenant took temporary command and began to summarize the information related to survival and to let the search team know that there are survivors every half an hour to knock on the door of the hatch with a hammer. NATO headquarters had been monitoring the location of the nuclear submarine since it left for the exercise, and when it exploded and was lost, NATO headquarters immediately received information and located it on a map. When they found out the nuclear submarine was missing in Norwegian territorial waters, the NATO commander immediately ordered the Norwegian government to start a search to steal the Russian nuclear submarine's technology. The Russian military headquarters is also in a state of chaos. The general ordered to find the nuclear submarine before NATO, but the Russians only have one old search and rescue boat. At that moment, the nuclear submarine's pipes began to leak, and the water level was already 150 centimeters high. The Russians quickly found spare tools and endured the freezing water to repair the pipes. The Russians checked that there are no other leaks and turn on the pumps to drain the water. Emergency services are available in compartment 9, but the oxygen cartridges of the oxygen generators are running low. Without oxygen, the Russians must be suffocating, and with insufficient oxygen, the sea must be pouring in. At the same time, NATO rescue boats arrived at the accident site but did not find any usable technology. NATO rescue boats began a frustrating search and rescue personnel immediately heard the sound of the Russians knocking. The NATO commander immediately informed the Russians because he was convinced that the Russians were incapable of rescuing them and would eventually have to call on NATO, and then they would be able to steal the results with a straight face.